better understand the consequences of our aggressive driving attitudes and behaviors, and to help us modify them, we need to recognize our options and choices. That's our objective then for this module, to learn how to analyze traffic situations and to recognize the choices that can determine the outcome of those situations. To help us out, I'm going to share with you a story of two young women whose choices ended in tragedy. Though this is a fictionalized account to dramatically highlight the events, I hope you pay attention to the main theme here. This story could be about any one of us. In fact, as we'll soon learn, the fatal outcome of our story was all too real, for it happens to people just like us. Ironically, that's the very comment 28-year-old Mary Williams made to her local New Jersey newspaper reporter when describing the birth of her triplets 4 years ago. An important fact in our story: a mother of 4-year-old triplets who also assists part-time at their daycare center is assumed to have a lot of patience. On a recent late summer morning during rush hour, Mary Williams' patience seemed to be absent as she drove the car to the daycare center. Luckily, her triplets were not in that car. They stayed home ill that fateful morning with their grandmother. Their colds may have saved their lives. Unfortunately, 30-year-old Susan Tyler was not as lucky. 6 months pregnant, she too was en route to the job she loved. A dietitian at the community hospital, she especially enjoyed teaching her patients about stress reduction as a vital part of an emotional diet. It's too bad that she did not follow her own counseling on stress reduction when she encountered, but did not resist, Mary Williams. Here's what happened. Mary Williams, driving her red Grand Am, was following behind Susan Tyler's orange Volkswagen on the same 2-lane highway they both traveled each workday. They were the last two in line following a slow-moving truck when Mary Williams decided to pull her Grand Am in the left lane in an attempt to pass. What kind of message was she sending out? What kind of message did Susan Tyler interpret and react to when she pulled into the passing lane, forcing Mary Williams to slam on her brakes? And what angry emotions came over Mary as Susan Tyler sped up her VW to overtake the long line of cars and ultimately returning to the right lane in front of the truck? As we can see, Mary Williams, still in the left lane, pulled her Grand Am even with the Volkswagen and proceeded to honk several times and make what appeared to be angry, obscene gestures towards Susan Tyler. I'm certain all of us, people like us, to quote Mary Williams, have at some time or another felt Mary's frustration. But given the fact that she's a mother of triplets and works with small children, she clearly should have had the patience to cope with the stress of driving and the common sense to let it go, to recognize it's not worth it, and to give the other driver the benefit of the doubt. Instead, she chose to let her emotions take over and to escalate the situation. Now, what choices did Susan Tyler have here? Was Mary Williams really making angry, obscene gestures and honking to protest? Or could she have been throwing her hands up in the air in exasperation and honking to alert the other driver that she had no room to move over safely? What would you do if you were the driver of that Volkswagen? A split second can make the difference between safety and disaster. Regrettably, Susan Tyler chose to let a stranger control her emotions when she responded to Mary Williams' apparent outburst with a visual response of her own. Following this now undeniable confrontation, Mary Williams sped up in an attempt to pass and pull in front of Susan Tyler's Volkswagen, an action which has clearly escalated the situation, to which Susan Tyler sped up in her Volkswagen and blocked Mary Williams from re-entering the right lane. In retaliation, Mary Williams opted to pull her Grand Am behind Susan Tyler's Volkswagen and put pressure on her by tailgating. Were there still choices available to these seemingly out-of-control drivers? Yes. This is not an involuntary situation, and even at this escalated choice point, there is still time and opportunity for either or both drivers to calm themselves down and opt out of this anger cycle. This horrible tragedy in the making could still be prevented by just one person deciding it's not worth it. Driving under the influence of her anger, Mary Williams, in a sudden moment of tremendous emotion, pulled out, around, and in front of Susan Tyler's Volkswagen, after which she abruptly hit the brakes. Their mutual choices created what was, finally and fatally, out of their control. Mary Williams' last action caused Susan Tyler to veer off the road and slam into a disabled vehicle. Susan Tyler is thrown from her car and receives massive internal injuries. Her unborn baby dies. A criminal trial is pending, but no matter what is legally decided in a court of law, it won't bring her baby back or undo what happened on the road. Just remember, it's not what happens, but how you react. That makes a life and death difference, because something very tragically similar to our story really did happen to people just like us. On November 27, 1996, in Silverton, Ohio, 24-year-old Tracy Alfieri, a mother of 2 small children, and 29-year-old Renee Andrews, 6 months pregnant, became 2 no longer anonymous drivers to each other. In fact, the crash that resulted in Renee Andrews' severe injuries and the loss of her unborn baby had made these 2 women permanently and intimately known to each other, their families, and the entire driving community. Tracy Alfieri was arrested and ultimately convicted of aggravated vehicular homicide and aggravated assault. Sentenced to 18 months in prison, she was released after serving part of her sentence when her own young daughter became seriously ill. To date, a civil trial is still pending. We're now going to take a closer look at the 8 choices available to the drivers if they had only given themselves the opportunity to make them. We'll call them choice points, and to help us all learn how to analyze our options so we never have to repeat the deadly events we just witnessed, we are joined once again by Chief Berger. Chief, welcome again.
Thank you, Denise.
I'm sure you've had some professional and personal reactions to this very sad event. You want to tell us about them?
The real tragedy is that this did not have to happen. If those drivers would have made the right decision and not participate in this cat and mouse game, that unborn child would be alive today.
You know, I think you clearly summed it up by saying that there's a split-second decision that could have been made had either driver made a decision to stop anywhere along the chain of events here. It could have been avoided.
Definitely escalated, there's no doubt about it.
Chief, we talked about the 8 choice points, these 2 drivers could have made. Let's talk a bit about those, if you don't mind addressing those for us here. Let's look at choice point number 1, passing a long line of cars.
This is extremely dangerous. Passing a long line of vehicles when there's little or limited visibility is taking your life into your own hands.
Okay, she violated some good common sense rules there in passing a long line of cars. But what about choice point number 2, impulsive reaction to pass another car?
Again, it's just the impatience, not wanting to wait long enough. When the Grand Am entered the passing lane, she made a conscious decision, and we find out, of course, it was wrong. It was very, very dangerous.
Perhaps she let her anger and her anxiousness get in the way. So we have the Grand Am impulsively reacting to pass this VW. Now choice point 3, pulling in front of the car. This is when the VW then cuts in front of the Grand Am. Maybe you can share with us what should have happened here instead.
Well, the Grand Am had committed itself. It should have been able to go ahead, if it could have safely passed the other vehicles. The VW has made a tragic mistake by pulling in front of a much more powerful car.
So we see that the entire chain of tragic events here could have stopped at this last choice point.
Starting to escalate now, yes.
But instead now we have choice point number 4, honking to protest and making angry, obscene gestures.
Now here comes aggressive driving. This is an emotional outcrying by the driver of the Grand Am to protest what the Volkswagen has done, which basically has caused the Grand Am to go ahead and apply its brakes.
Chief, what you're saying makes complete sense. We've been learning along the way here how people need to rely and develop their own driving conscience and follow their own inner standards of behavior. But that's not happening with either driver, because choice point number 5 is retaliatory anger gestures that continue to be exchanged, this time by the VW driver.
Well, the anger is escalating, the excessive honking, the gestures, almost like fighting words. But the important point is here, all it takes is one driver to go ahead and stop, and it could de-escalate this entire situation.
Unfortunately, it doesn't stop, and it continues to get even worse. Choice point number 6, choosing to challenge another driver and further escalate the aggressive driving situation. There is now a real clear opportunity to stop this event from worsening. In fact, the VW driver actually sped up, though, to block the Grand Am. What do you think could have happened to change the outcome here?
Well, again, this to me borders on criminal intent, the Volkswagen's activities. What that Volkswagen needed to do is just say, end this right now. And again, we know the situation of this woman. She's with child. She needs to back off of this situation, let the Grand Am pass. Whether it's right or wrong is not important right now. This is now a dangerous situation.
Seems to me a clear-cut case of somebody not making the right choice and letting their frustrations and emotions get in the way of common sense here and not thinking of the consequences.
Absolutely.
Which leads us up to choice point number 7, tailgating to keep up the pressure. Now, this is a really important message I think we need to pass along here.
This is extremely dangerous because now, as you said, now it's strictly emotional. There's no good common sense here being exhibited at all, no safety as far as the practices of either driver. This is now a dangerous cat and mouse game.
Now at this point we have the Grand Am has pulled behind the VW and is now tailgating. Now the Grand Am suddenly decides to pass the VW, pull in front of the VW and slam on her brakes. Choice point number 8, slamming on the brakes to punish another driver. Now this is where this whole scenario turned deadly.
This became a crime when that driver in the Grand Am decided to go ahead and do that. And it didn't have to happen, but it did, and the results were tragic, the loss of an unborn child.
You know, people need to realize from this event that driving is not a competitive behavior. It needs to be a cooperative effort among all drivers in the driving community.
But you can clearly see with this incident, this was intentional, this was emotional, this was heated, and again, the results were tragic.
Chief Berger, thanks so much for joining us today and for helping and teaching us how to analyze traffic situations and recognize that we always have choices. Now it's up to all of us in the driving community to exercise those choices. Acknowledge that you have them. Witness yourself making positive choices. We hope this case study will help everyone modify their attitudes and behavior before they get behind the steering wheel of their cars. As we've seen today, it's not worth it.
Acknowledge, witness, modify, and watch your safety multiply. Acknowledge, witness, modify. It's the way to drive. It's the way to drive.